Next, I'd like to bring to the stage two extraordinary speakers, David Rothkopf and Yasheng Huang. David is the CEO of the Rothkopf Group, which does a variety of business and media work, including here in Abu Dhabi, where every year they convene the Culture Summit. He's also an active commentator on a whole host of geopolitical and geoeconomic issues. If you are a fan of podcasts, I recommend very highly the Deep State Radio that he produces and hosts. And he's authored numerous important books, including The Great Questions of Tomorrow. Yasheng Huang is a professor of international management at MIT, at their Sloan School of Management, where he founded and runs both their China and their India labs. He also holds the International Program Professorship in Chinese economy and business. He's a fellow at numerous universities, both in the United States and China. He's the co-principal investigator of an exciting new project on food safety in China. And in 2010, he was named one of the most outstanding scholars in the United States by the National Asia Research Program. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. So, thank you both. Before we dive back into talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, I'd like to start by asking you, Yasheng, how you see the current state of Chinese state capitalism. This is a topic you've written about a great deal, and it seems to me a topic that is essential to how we might understand the strategies and the content of the Belt and Road.
Yeah. So the idea of state capitalism is that the state, the government, controls what is known as commanding heights sector of the economy. So today, if you look at the Chinese economy, the upstream part of the Chinese economy is still heavily dominated by the state-owned enterprises. We're talking about energy, heavy industry, banks, telecommunication. And then the downstream, we have a vibrant private sector, manufacturing firms and service firms. And the state, so, typical economic theory will tell you that the state firms are not very efficient. Over time, they should sort of gradually move away from control of this. I see President Sarkozy here in France in the 1960s and 70s. The state was also very, very powerful. What has happened is that instead of moving toward more private sector end of that spectrum, China has strengthened the state control part of the economy. And One Belt, One Road program, there's some private sector participation, but a huge number of the firms are still state-owned enterprises. And these state-owned enterprises are partially profit-oriented, but they also have political mandates and political leadership, and they have to pay attention to what the government is saying. But for a period of time, these state-owned enterprises gained some operational autonomy, and they had to raise capital on Chinese stock exchange, and they had to answer the expectations and the behavior of the investors. So increasingly, there's beginning of a divergence between what the government expected them to do and what these state-owned enterprises wanted to do. So I think I would say over time, under the current leadership, the gap has been narrowed a little bit, although the gap is still there. So one issue that came up in the previous two sessions is to what extent Chinese firms are financially viable when they go abroad to make investments. And many of these state-owned enterprises have many shareholders, and the shareholders don't care about foreign policy objectives. They care about returns on their capital. So there is an unresolved issue to the extent that you have projects that are problematic in terms of creditworthiness of the countries, and also in terms of the intrinsic nature of these projects, whether or not the government has sufficient political mandate to dictate the terms. I've heard that some Chinese firms have flatly come out and refused to undertake some projects because in their perception, these are not money-making projects. So the topic today is what is the Chinese ambition through the One Belt, One Road. I kind of think that a slightly different framing of the question is really whether or not the political ambition and the economic ambition can coincide precisely, given that China now has this mixed structure of the economy. And that's a question mark. I don't necessarily have the answer.
Thank you. David, given what we've just heard, how do you see the most important strategic or even just economic dimensions of the Belt and Road at this point? We heard that at the beginning of the Belt and Road, perhaps these were focused on building a corridor with Pakistan, building a narrow set of projects in Eurasia. How do you see that changing, and where do you see it now?
Well, I think what we're seeing is a maturation of China. And I think what we're seeing is China beginning to pursue a role in the world that is suitable with its size and national identity. And this is the first time we've really seen that. In fact, you may recall at the beginning of the Obama administration, there was a bunch of talk about the G2. You know, the US and China, that would be the G2. And the Chinese were like, oh, no, that's not the role for us. And then last year, you had Xi Jinping in Davos going, well, look, if the United States is not going to play the leading role, we'll play the leading role. And I think this is the big tilt, is that China's saying, look, we're big, we have to play this role, and it's because it's in their interests. It's not because they have some nefarious or grand ambition. It's because they want to protect the flow of resources to their country that they need. They want to protect their borders. They want to protect their economic options so that they can grow in the way that they want to. And so sometimes those ambitions are purely economic, and sometimes they're not. And so you have the Chinese opening not too far from here, their first overseas military base in Djibouti in Africa. And you look at that and you say, well, that's in Africa, but it's not. It's really here. It's in the Middle East, and the next one will probably be in Pakistan. And then all of a sudden you'll have two Chinese military bases on either side of the Persian Gulf and on either side. And you know, you sort of look at these things, and strategically, they're trying to protect the flow of energy in and out of China, just as the road into Pakistan is trying to protect access into this part of the world, or their interests in Central Asia are, you know, seeking to protect that, or the building railways to Europe are seeking to protect those flows. And so it's you know, it's kind of almost organic. If you have a big organism, it needs a lot of inputs in order to survive. And the Belt and Road is you know, it's kind of you can imagine a cell reaching out and, you know, trying to connect to the places that can feed it. And so it's, you know, it's strategic, but it's also inevitable. There is no plan B. There is no way for China to grow and maintain its growth rate without connecting out into the rest of the world and protecting its prerogatives in that regard.
Yeah.
So I do want to add to what David just said. So essentially, since the end of the World War, there was a presumption that trade and investments take place under a international infrastructure, such as WTO, IMF, and World Bank, and the associated international framework. Having a navy, having an aircraft is tangential to that consideration, right? So, and I do believe the bulk of evidence supports that view, right? Rather than relying on the navy, you don't really need that now to have trade between Africa and China. It is possible that now there's a different view, right? And it's a view that's built on a less of trust in what is known as a Pax Americana, right? And the view is that maybe we shouldn't rely on a sort of expressed desire on the United States to protect the safe passage of international water, and we kind of have to come in and do that ourselves, right? So whether that view is right or wrong, you know, we can have a debate, but I do want to describe a dramatically different view that has arisen that's associated with the rise of China. In my own view, China has been the biggest beneficiary of the current global international system. Look at how it grew under that system. It was a poor country 40 years ago. Now it's the second largest GDP in the world. It is largest trading country in the world. All of that took place under the WTO system, under the globalization framework. I don't really see any evidence that we should challenge that. And so I would caution against sort of coming up with a totally new idea of how you get rich. And I think the international system has served China, countries like China and India very, very well. There are some issues and definitely we need to address. Much of the debate about globalization is actually objective debate, right? So much of the academic debate about globalization is not about the sharing of the benefits between rich countries and poor countries. Actually, rich countries have benefited. Much of the debate is really about within rich countries, right? There are people who gain, there are people who lose, and what do you do with the people who have lost? But that's a within the country debate rather than across the country debate. And we shouldn't sort of lump all these issues together and question globalization.
If I can, sure. I want to say two things. First of all, the view that the United States sold of the world at the end of the Second World War was trust the system. We'll maintain our Navy, we'll maintain our Air Force, we'll maintain our capacity. You work within the color within the lines that we're drawing here, right? And no major power of the world has ever done that. They do protect their own interests. So I think it's natural that China does that. The other thing is, I think that we have to recognize the Pax Americana is coming to an end. I think that the post-Cold War reality of the United States intervening everywhere, playing this big role, is changing. It's not that the United States is shuffling off the stage. It's not that it won't be a major power. But it is not the same as it was. And we're seeing, in the Middle East is a perfect example, where it's not just Donald Trump's administration, because Barack Obama's administration also was pulling back. And places, and countries like Russia, and countries like China, and other entities are stepping in to fill that void. And so, to be perfectly honest, it's not just China's rise. It's changes among the other great powers that create the necessity for China to protect its own interests because others may not.
So it is important to keep in mind that having your own protection and all of that is not cost-free. Right. It implies massive cost. So China is the second largest GDP in the world, that's true. On a per capita basis, the country is right in the middle of about 190 countries. So on a per capita basis, this is not a rich country, right? And the Pax Americana comes down in part because of the lack of leadership of the current administration. If I were a poor developing country with a middle income, I actually want to free ride, right? So my economic incentive is to free. This is what Japan did. This is what South Korea did. It worked out beautifully for them. Why would I spend the money to do the things that are provided in the first place? So unless I don't trust that's a legitimate idea. The other thing we need to remember is that with all this money around $50 billion, $1 trillion, China has a massive foreign exchange reserve. But let's get the basic central bank accounting right. To the foreigners, these foreign exchange reserve is an asset. To the Chinese domestic citizens, it is a liability. It is not owned by the government. It is owned by the citizens and corporations in China. So you can't really kind of throw that money around without any regard for financial returns and economic viability. You have to, the bottom line is you have to think about financial issues and returns, because that's not really your money. It is money entrusted to you to manage and to take custody of.
Right. One question I want to follow up on that what you've just said raises is, we've heard today a fair amount of discussion about this idea that China might be increasingly trying to export elements of its own development model, and that the Belt and Road might be one element of that. And I'm curious for you both to hear from you both what you think of that.
Well, I mean, I think China is seeking to advance its economic interests, to provide the resources that it needs to grow, to provide, access to those resources, whether that is building the mine, building the road, building the port, or building the relationship with the local government that allows them access to the mine or the port or the road. And I think they've proven to be quite pragmatic in terms of what do they do, when they're operating in the West versus what do they do when they're operating in the developing world, and how do they operate? They don't operate the same way in Latin America as they do in Africa. They've been adapting to each one of these things. I don't see a big component of proselytizing. It's not like the United States where we're proselytizing and we're going and saying the American way, and with every care package you get, there's a little flag in it, and do it our way. It's like, what's going to work? And I think that sort of Chinese pragmatism is really the hallmark.
Well, I think there are two economic arguments why they are doing this. Whether any specific project satisfies those two conditions is a separate issue, because I don't really know the project specifically. One is China has this incredibly developed scaling capability, right? So this is one of the few countries where you can scale, from 1 to 1 million, 1 billion very, very quickly. And China has done that, and they have developed the capability to do that. So the natural extension is to extend that capability beyond your border, because China itself is pretty much built up, right? So you don't really need to continue to build these things within China. You asked about China model. It depends. The answer to your question depends on what you think is the right China model. My own view is that the right China model is that this is a country that has invested in education. If you look at data, China in the 1970s and 1980s had horrible infrastructures. But they invested in basic education, they invested in primary education, they invested in public health. Essentially, if you compare China with India, the public health outcome achieved by China in 1971, India is only able to achieve that by about 2001. Right? So we're talking, if you look at the income gap between the two countries, it's about 2 to 1. But if you look at the investment in early education, in basic education, in public health, China was way ahead of India. And China grew as a result of that basic investment in education and public health. Once they grew, the government began to earn revenue from that, making money, corporations making money, and the government can tax these companies. And then government has money to make investments in infrastructure. So we typically think about infrastructure as the cause for growth. The larger evidence that I have seen is exactly the opposite. Infrastructures are a result of the growth, right? If you look at the United States, when the interstate highway system was built in the United States, it was built under Eisenhower administration. What was the share of the US GDP in the 1950s? It's 50%. 50%. US was already the richest country, and then it began to build infrastructures. In Japan, in South Korea, they first grew their economy because they made critical right investments in human capital. And then they began to build hard infrastructures. I hope that people learn the right lesson from China, which is never substitute infrastructure, hard infrastructure investments like highways and airports. Never substitute that with investments in basic education. The trade-off is actually a very real one. If you're a poor country, you don't have a lot of money. You invest more in A, by definition, you're going to invest less in B. if you make that trade-off in favor of hard infrastructures rather than in favor of soft infrastructures such as public health and basic education, I would argue you are not learning the right China model.
Very interesting. David, I'm wondering what you think the United States, other countries in the West, but particularly our home country, should be doing about the Belt and Road Initiative, and more generally should be doing about the reality that China will, within the next 20 years, be the world's largest economy. So what do you think we should be doing, and are we doing it?
Well, let me start with the second question, which is no. We're not doing it. We haven't adapted. We've seen a number of instances recently, whether it's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank fiasco, where we kind of missed the boat on that one entirely, or TPP, where the United States has had a chance to go in and either engage or to counterbalance, and we just haven't done it. There was a talk about a pivot to Asia that didn't really happen in the Obama administration, and the Trump administration is just circling the drain right now. So it's not really,
to say the least.
right, so it doesn't really have the bandwidth to go and deal with anything except for crises. I think one has to respond to it in several ways. First of all, you need a doctrine that deals with the reality of a U.S.-China world. It's not a new Cold War. There's a fad right now in the United States, which is to say, we got this China thing all wrong. We thought if they got rich, they'd become just like us. Well, actually, nobody thought that. There are a lot of articles saying that, but actually, nobody thought that, right? They were going to become like China, and that's somewhat different. But we are completely interdependent with China, as Donald Trump is about to learn. You go and you launch a trade war, and you're gonna pay a price, economic and also political. So you need a doctrine that's based on interdependence. And then you also need one that's based on the reality not of a bipolar world, but really of a multipolar world where there are a number of big players in it. And then it's got to have strategic and economic components. And I think part of that, you might want to sort of borrow a Chinese concept of harmony or balance as opposed to confrontation. But I think some of the balance involves things like, and by the way, this will be the only time anybody ever hears me say something positive about Donald Trump foreign policy. But they have embraced the idea of referring to the region that China and the US share as the Indo-Pacific region, as opposed to the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that's a very important concept, and I don't think we're going to go backwards. There's no way to balance China without bringing India into the picture. And I think the Quad, which is a kind of a dead idea from that part of the world, is coming back to life. And I think the United States and India and Australia and Japan are going to play a central role in that balancing, strategically speaking. But I think that we have to recognize that balance is balance. And that means we have to engage, we have to do the trade deals, we have to have the partnerships, we need to find as many places as we can cooperate with China as possible. We need to acknowledge that there's some places where they will be in the lead, just as we must do with Europe and others. And so we need to evolve to a sensible policy that is a new one. It's not, there are people right now in the Pentagon going, oh yeah, okay, so maybe it's not terrorism that we've been just misled by for the past 18 years. It's great powers, so let's get out all those dusty Cold War playbooks and the Chinese are the enemy. Let's build, to offset that. That's not the world we're living in. It's a different reality, and it needs its own playbook.
Thank you.
So I think this theme of collaboration is really important to emphasize. And the danger is that politicians don't sufficiently recognize the importance of collaboration. It's true in the US as well as true in China. If you look at US, right, so we celebrate US as science and technology and all of that. But if you look at who is doing science and who is doing technology, MIT, we have 40%, maybe that's a low estimate. More than 40% of the faculty were born outside of the United States. Our current president was born in Latin America, right? So the success, Silicon Valley, Chinese and Indians, the success of the US is on the back of global talent pool rather than simply because of the United States. We have done an analysis of scientific papers published by Chinese scientists. So we rank these journals by journal impact factor. Some are good and some are not so good. If you look at the high journal impact factor publications, they are almost 100% the result of collaboration, right? So this idea, the rise of China means that they are going to be hegemonic power and getting rid of the collaboration. There are people in China who are advocating that view of the world. It is extremely dangerous because they don't even understand how China got to the place in the first place. It got to that place because of collaboration, because of the peaceful environment, because of trade, because foreign direct investment, because of liberalization. And something else I want to say, the biggest misunderstanding of China is it is a result of big government programs and all of that. As I said, that came up much later. That happened much later. The earlier impetus of growth came from entrepreneurs, private entrepreneurs. The most developed part of China today is the most liberal, actually both in political and economic measure, Shenzhen and all of that. The part that is most kind of state-controlled today is stagnating, right? The northeast part of China, state-owned enterprises, and people say, for political stability, they should protect the state sector. Guess where the political instability happens? It happens in the regions where you have most of the SOEs, right? So I can't even think of a good political argument to preserve the SOEs. The economic evidence is overwhelming. Private entrepreneurship, financial liberalization, some basic rule of law, and predictability, and political stability are the ingredients behind Chinese growth, not the big government program.